Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're catching up on a whole bunch of X of Swords comics. So, the been a little busy with some stuff, and you'll actually notice I got a couple new posters up in the background. It's a little hard to see. I was trying to get rid of the glare, which is why we're starting a little bit late. Go up. But we got they're the covers to the first issues of X Factor and Juggernaut. Had two posters arrive this week. So that was pretty cool, and it's nice to have a little update back there. But we also have had a bunch of stuff come out for the X of Swords event, ranging from X Factor, Wolverine, X-Force, and Marauders. All of their most recent issues make up the next four chapters of X of Swords. So we've covered a lot of Prelude stuff and their first book, but now we have part 2, 3, 4, and 5 to talk about. I'm not totally sure what the exact plan is in terms of covering all these books. We'll talk a little bit about how important they all are, but I do feel like there's clearly this core story going on when it comes to X of Swords or Ten of Swords, depending on how you prefer it. I was corrected and told it was Ten of Swords, but since then I've gotten the impression the vast majority of the fan base prefers X of Swords. I kind of like how it goes both ways. Stormy, Ajay Faye. I don't think I said your last name right, if that is your real last name. But Adrian Benningfield, thanks for joining us, guys. Um, Overall, though, I think each of these books kind of present a different range of content as they feature different creative teams, but they're all excellent books and showcase a pretty cool story, but they're also they very much feel like tie-ins. So the first book in X of Swords was all about setting up this big tournament thing that's going to go on between Krakoa and Araco, and we know there has to be 10 fighters. X Factor number 4 does feel very relevant in kind of building up on that idea, but it also gives us a vague sense of who those 10 are going to be. And then the next three books are about exploring, basically, those members starting to get their swords. And by the end of book number 5, we have 3 members ready to enter the tournament with their swords intact, with a bit of a story behind each of them. Adrian says, just got back from getting my new comics from the local shop I use. That's cool. Oh, I gotcha. Story says his last name's Pig Latin. Okay, well, I feel less bad. Sometimes I worry that I butcher names that are even common in just other countries and pronunciations. It happens a lot, and I feel bad. Pig Latin, not so much. Adrian Benningfield says, that sounds like a take off the Contest of Champions. They deliberately use language that evokes the Contest of Champions. They call it a contest and they say they're gathering champions and stuff like that. It is similar, and that's like kind of the crux of this event. It's that meets like DC's death metal combined into a story, I would say, overall. And it's pretty fun. For those who have been wondering, do I need to buy all 22 parts? I would say personally, I found it rewarding so far to do so. As you see these connections, they either are building these connections into stuff introduced either in House of X era X-Men comics or even from before then. It has a lot of cool little details of stuff that I think is going to affect things beyond even this tie-in event story within each of these individual series. But I don't think you're going to have to read every single part to get the core of what's going on here. You could easily have skipped, for example, Wolverine number 6 and gotten a pretty good idea of it. Although that being said, like I said earlier, X Factor number 4 is pretty damn important. So I guess it's going to be a while, so let's start to dig through these because we're talking about 4 books today. We pick up right where the first X of Swords book led off, where we have all these injured people arriving from Otherworld. And it's confirmed at this point, even though it was pretty heavily implied before, but Rockslide is straight up dead. Summoner cut him in half and knew how to strike in just such a way that it killed him. And Polaris gets some sort of crazy vision from, what's it called, Saturnine. of Otherworld. She's like the ruler of all these domains. And then the external gate closes. Saturnine does it. Krakoa gets all upset because he wanted it open, but and argues with Cypher over it. But there's nothing they can do about it, and they pointed out like it wasn't our decision to do that, and if we want that gate back open, or if we want to deal with Hirako, we have to play by Otherworld's rules and go through this tournament. The next page, and these happen throughout the rest of the X of Swords books. It's a guide of sorts to the various realms of Otherworld, the provinces of Otherworld, as they currently exist following the fall of the Cat and Britain Corps. So for fans of Otherworld or people interested in this domain that don't know anything about it, it's still like it's useful information either way. We learned about the floating kingdom of Roma, Virginia, which is ruled over by Lady Roma after she split up with her father Merlin. And it seems like some sort of very borderline anarchist fairy domain of some kind. But they're all very interesting. And one thing I noticed when I was reading these X Swords books that I'll say in general is I find they're nice, slow reads. And just because it takes something longer to read, like it takes me longer to read these X-Men books, not just X Swords, but, well, I guess especially X Swords, but X-Men books in general compared to the average comic because they have these long pages of exposition. I'm sure some people don't like it, but I find like they just add in little details and insight into some certain characters' thoughts. I really like them. I think they're very strong. Adrian says mutant combat. Hey, this would make a cool ass fighting game of some kind. I'll say that, especially with all those swords and stuff. Stormy says we love swords. Well, you gotta kind of buy into that theme because it's all swords from here on out. They very much play up that theme, but so far it hasn't been dry. And we'll kind of get into that as we go along. Bootley says, I'm a fan of Hunter x Hunter, so I'm used to it. There's other franchises that are very sword heavy. This is the first time I feel the X-Men has truly gone in that direction, although as we get into things, we'll very much acknowledge the fact that it's not new entirely for the franchise. And we'll elaborate on that some more. Everyone tries to poke around in Polaris's head, using it like the telepaths, I should say, and Saturnine has a block that just like plinks them away, basically. It's a fun little moment where like Monet says, I already tried that, like when Rachel Summers attempts it. Apocalypse like attacks his healer, saying that like he needs to help Richter since the two of them are connected in some weird way. It's kind of interesting. Apocalypse is just all over, like I was gonna say all over the place as a character with X's swords, but I don't mean that in a negative. Like he's dealing with his ancient original horsemen who seem to be his children. I don't know how literal that statement is, but I think it is. He's got the external gate and all of that stuff. His betrayal from the summoner, and now he's actively like fighting with the people trying to help him, and it's interesting for his character. He's not a huge part of the rest of these books going forward, but he is interesting. Then we get another book about another realm. This is the Holy Republic of Fae that's ruled by Merlin, whereas Roma's realm is kind of chaotic. His is overly orderly to the extent that he's damaged his own province. Adrian says, swords, wait, where is Shatterstar? Well, we actually know exactly where Shatterstar is in Mojoverse at the moment. If you check out either our reviews of or the earlier X Factor books, because we are technically like going through X Factor right now, it's all about Shatterstar. I don't think he'll be showing up in X's Swords though, although I could be wrong, because X Factor's got more stuff coming, and there's definitely like I think Shatterstar will be back at some point. So then we get a page that someone had mentioned in my previous stream. It's a full two-page spread dedicated to Chadwick Boseman. This actually isn't the only book where this spread appears across various books tributing the actor, including, I think, all of the X of Swords books. I definitely recommend everyone read this tribute because it's widely available across these Marvel books, and I'm sure online as well, because no one would object to sharing that. I won't read it all here, but it really hits home, especially because I'm actively reading a book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote this tribute, and it's very relevant if you know what Howard University means to Coates and the relevance of having like met and interacted with Boseman at Howard University. It's moving stuff, and a nice tribute to Boseman that they consistently do in a lot of these Marvel comics, which is cool. I really liked it. So then we get into so Polaris meets up with Xavier and the five responsible for resurrecting mutants. They haven't really created resurrection protocols when it comes to a time of war, but they decide that's relevant to this moment and to resurrect Rockslide immediately along with Richter. However, and Richter gets resurrected fine, but when they try and implant Rockslide's memories, something goes horribly wrong, and the entire Cerebro network gets knocked out in ways that we didn't even know could happen. Like Cradle 4, which we hadn't seen before, is clearly where Moira's hanging out in somewhere called No Place, and Xavier collapses. The five go into a full panic because something's gone wrong with Resurrection in a way they don't understand, and all the Cerebro's down, and they blame the eggs, actually. They think there's something wrong with the eggs. So Elixir, who, I think that's his name. I want to say. His real name's Josh, but, oh, yeah, they'll say it at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, Elixir. He has the powers to, like, heal people, but also he kind of has control of biology, and he can, like, create decay and things. So he wipes out the eggs. And, Xavier wakes up and the network comes back online, but Xavier's furious and he's like, "Oh, what the hell did you guys do? Like, you knocked out the eggs. You shouldn't have done that." And they try talking, so they're like, "Okay, well, whatever. We can't do anything about that." They try to talk to Rockslide, and he's changed. He's very skinny now and looks visually different in his rock form. I guess he's always in his rock form. And they realize something's wrong with him. They all eyes turn to Richter because, like, he was just resurrected alongside him, but Xavier's able to use his telepathy to, like, verify that he's fine. He's the same person they knew from before, so something's wrong. We get this little after report, and pretty quickly it emerges what happened and what went wrong was Rockslide died in Otherworld, and that apparently completely messes up the resurrection protocol. So what happens is, because Otherworld's sort of this spoke in the wheel of reality, it corrupted the copy they had of Rockslide in their archives that they use to resurrect mutants that have died. And what that means is they can never bring back Rockslide as he originally is, and that character is basically permanently gone. And the version that they've resurrected is the only one they can create now, and it's either a random variation of that being like that exists somewhere else in the multiverse, or is some sort of amalgamation of all potential iterations of Rockslide. And there's different reports and different characters have a different interpretation. I think it's more of the idea of him being some sort of amalgamation character based on where that idea comes from, an after action report where in theory they've had more time to think about it and analyze this, whereas the idea of him just being some sort of random variation is something one of the characters says sort of in the immediate aftermath. That's my interpretation of things, but either way, they don't know, and all the eggs are gone. So they have to grow more eggs, and basically resurrection protocol is put on immediate hold. That doesn't matter because Polaris is able to take, like, the original remnants of the Rockslide before he died, and it manages to evoke that little thing that Saturnine planted in her, and she rattles out this prophecy. And it's got a lot of ambiguous stuff. I think some of it's meant to be more clear than others, but it's clearly referencing the 10 people they will need to bring into this contest in order to like these are the 10, these are the swords they need in order to enter the contest and potentially save Krakoa. And also Earth, that becomes clear at this point, because if Araco wins, those forces are just going to invade and overwhelm Earth. So it's very important that they get these characters and these swords in line and into a portal. And Polaris uses the remnants of Rockslide to forge this little portal that will bring them into the tournament based on like Saturnine's instructions. It's a nice little touching moment. And when each of them come to it, then the gate will open. Now, out of the prophecy, a few characters recognize the references to themselves in the words of the prophecy, and they know what they have to do. And some of them set out to get the sword, but one of them already has the sword, and that character's Magic. She already has that sword. That's like already been a long part of her character. It's like a demon-y sword that's got like part of her soul in it or something like that. So Ileana shows up at the portal and says, let's get ready to show these Araco mutants and weird demonic denizens like our finest Krakoan diplomacy, pound the war drums. And she stands at the portal and it glows on her little symbol. We then get a very helpful page giving us kind of what we know about the prophecy and stuff. So the first one is in reference to Ileana, and she knows it's in like reference to her, so she's ready to go out of the gate. The next one is a pretty clear reference to Cable, who already has a sword that's been part of his series. So again, that seems like a pretty clear shoo-in. He's already been teased in little prophecies and stuff so far, so that one isn't a surprise. The next one is a reference to Warlock. Oh, by the way, like Doug is the one writing this, so he's like, okay, I guess like Warlock can turn into a sword and I can't, so maybe it's part of us going into it. But then there's a reference to many becoming one, and he doesn't know what that's referencing, so that's interesting. The next one is Storm. We will actually get into her in Marauders. And then the next one after that is a reference to the Muramasa Blade, and Logan, as they're writing this report, has already set out to go into that. We'll follow up on that in the next 2 issues of this stream. This is going to be a pretty long and hefty stream, by the way, because we've got 4 different books to talk about. After that is a very interesting prophecy in reference to the Braddock twins, which, as Doug says, like, Brian Braddock isn't a mutant. He was Captain Britain. I don't know if he still has any powers at the moment. And Psylocke has often wielded psychic weapons and swords of sorts in the past. So that will be very curious, and we haven't quite got the follow-up on that yet. The next one is apparently a reference to Gorgon, and he showed up when they were talking of swords, and he's sure this one is for him. And he is going to go get that. And then the last one, they don't give away. It says, a father forsaken, a husband betrayed, an ancient treasure sharpens the death his children crave. And Doug says, like Cypher that is, this is another one that's going to be claimed pretty quickly by someone I'm not going to fight with. Blank with a little A symbol says he's known from the beginning he's going in and he's gone to collect his swords. I mean, that's got to be Apocalypse, though. And like, even as I'm reading that and looking at it, yeah, it's going to be him, because he's clearly a big part of this story. Okay, I haven't checked in with chat in a little bit, so let's see what you guys have said. The Ninja Genko, thanks for joining us, along with Boot Lee. Ninja is saying he's working on a character. I'm wondering if you can be my advisor, so to speak. Sure, you can always drop a line through our various social media or whatever with your idea for something. I don't mind bouncing that off of you or whatever. Try3 was saying, hey, thought it was established when Xavier was assassinated. They have consciousness backups in other versions of Cerebro. So they actually talk about that. And this Otherworld process, for whatever reason, and they haven't fully explained it, but it overwrites all copies of the character no matter what backups they have. It has some sort of weird mystical effect on it or something like that. I think it's fine, because the whole point of Otherworld is it's got a specific relationship to reality, and this is a kind of interesting wrinkle to Resurrection that should exist. Now, let's say a big name character dies, like Logan or something like that, which I think they're kind of hinting at. well, then the character transforms and changes, but isn't necessarily gone. So if a writer in the future wants to use them, they have the opportunity to do so while there's still this like cost of the character having died and that history being gone, and a writer can now forge a new history, which I would think would be potentially interesting. Trithay was saying, oh, because it's another dimension or a pocket dimension. It's sort of like a nexus between, as I understand it, all realities and stuff like that, which is why it specifically has an effect. If a mutant were traveling in time or in a regular alternate dimension, I don't believe it would have the same effect, is my belief. It wouldn't affect the backup copies, for example. So, yeah. Yeah, but that's a good question. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next book, because we got a long ways to go. Although the next one's relatively... Oh, I didn't even mention. X of Swords was written by... X Factor was written by Leah Williams. Carlos Gomez does the coloring. Israel Silva does the... Carlos Gomez does the artwork. Israel Silva does the coloring. Joe Camanga does lettering. It's an excellent book. It's well drawn. It nicely shifts the focus ever so slightly towards the involved X Factor characters, but still very much feels like the most critical out of the books we're talking about in understanding X of Swords. I really like the prophecy, the details, and this is also where I first read that tribute to Chadwick Boseman, so I really enjoyed and appreciated this book on the whole. I really like Gomez's artwork. It's got a nice mix of like cartoony, sort of relatively light artwork, but very expressive and really working and conveying some big moments that happen throughout this book in a distinct way from the more epic, realistic looking stuff we've gotten so far out of X of Swords. It felt like its own little thing and a cool way to kind of get me excited for like the next phase of X of Swords, where it's all these characters gathering these different swords. And to that end, Wolverine number 6 by Ben Percy. Let's see here. Victor Bogdanovic doing the artwork, Matthew Wilson doing the coloring, Corey Petit lettering, is all about Wolverine getting his sword, the Muramasa blade. Now this book is great because it goes into the past and explains how Logan has a history with the sword and what that history is. Talks about how he thought he lost his wife Itsu and his son Dakin, and so he forged a blade with a part of his soul in it, I guess, or with his soul in it or something, called the Muramasa blade. The world's greatest swordsmith Muramasa forged a blade named Muramasa for him, I should say, because that's very relevant. And he goes to seek it. And we open where Logan is on, like, midway through his hunt in the depths of hell. So we flash back a little bit. Logan actually speaks to Krakoa directly and says how he believes the island wanted war. And once again, Ben Percy uses the Wolverine series to kind of present these elements of the world of Krakoa from Logan's perspective. And it's always interesting. Logan talks about how, like Logan's talked before about how death is still relevant in this world, how he doesn't just buy Krakoa being this endless paradise for mutants, and that there will be trouble and struggles ahead. All these little interesting elements that I hadn't considered in the world of Krakoa and House of X before. And he does it again here, where Logan says, like, Krakoa really is what matters, because he's the landmass on what they live, in spite of what the Quiet Council might think. And this island is very much dragging them into war. And he's not like, he understands it is what it is, and he's going to fight, but he's never going to trust the island again, which is interesting. Logan was having those doubts before, and those seem only magnified at this point. So he goes off to get the sword, and the rest of this book is largely about that journey. It's incredibly well drawn. It starts with him fighting with Silver Samurai to find out where he's going. Silver Samurai is quite upset that he wasn't chosen for this, but nevertheless, he relents after a brief fight and tells him what he knows, which is very little, but it is enough for Logan to begin his journey. Meanwhile, we cut to Araco at this tower, this first watchtower to fall in this great war. And the Horsemen War and which one is it? Pestilence go down and meet with this character named Solem. He's very clearly to be one of the champions to fight in this upcoming contest, and it even becomes more clear shortly after. It's kind of cool. He looks very much like a child of Apocalypse or something like that, and he's been living in this pit all the time because he slayed War's spouse, I believe. Wife, I should say. And they'd say like, "Oh, you got to participate in this tournament, and you're gonna need a sword." And he's like, "I already got a sword," or like, "I already have a weapon." And he pulls out this dagger, and it's got some interesting hell powers of some kind. And they're like, "No, you're gonna need a sword, and you have to get a blade called Muramasa," which is interesting because that's the blade Wolverine needs. The Arakoans have their own prophecy and their own information they're following on very clearly. And he's like, all right, whatever. He jumps out of the pit he's supposedly imprisoned in. And they're also like, oh, he should have been starving and bored out of his mind because he's been in this prison for thousands of years. And they find him with like food and drink because people like him in Araco and have been bringing him stuff all this time. He's a very interesting character. Then we go into this amazing spread across 2 pages. It's a little hard just because the eye movements that comics are always supposed to kind of facilitate and help you read don't work the way they should. And I didn't realize you're supposed to go left to right when reading this book at first, but I figured it out eventually. And it's Logan going from like a nightclub to like this holy temple to actually meeting Mariko, and she explains that how the hand has been split, and she's now the Scarlet Samurai and part of this faction of the hand that's split from this other part that directly serves the beast, apparently. We learn a little bit more that they're like they've gone to hell, literally. They've opened a portal. And it's part of an interesting pattern that seems to be fitting in with something going on where the border between Araco and Krakoa is splitting. Like these boundaries seem to be weakening. And there's something larger going on with that, I believe. But Logan tracks down this other faction of the hand, and they've slain Muramasa. And Logan finds him in hell, where apparently he needs Wolverine's help. And that is directly followed up on in Percy's other series in this X of Swords book that came out right after. So if you're reading Wolverine number 6, you pretty much have to read X-Force number 13. But it's cool because there's no delay. It's right here, which I do kind of like. This is like a two-parter thing that's just kind of happening back to back as part of X of Swords, and I enjoyed it. So we confirmed that Logan basically got like pushed through this portal into hell. The hand, this faction of the hand is all demonic and undead. And Wolverine gets like knocked into lava, so his like adamantium skeleton has to like crawl up to Muramasa. And he's like, all right, I need your help, and we got to go to this ceremony. And Logan ends up imprisoned by these demons, while Muramasa has actually forged, it's revealed, 2 blades. Logan then encounters Solem, who learned through some creepy witch that he could find the Muramasa blade in hell, and Solem used his dagger to open up a portal. The two of them then encounter each other in prison, and Logan attacks because he's like, oh, well, if we're going to fight each other in the tournament, why don't I just kill you now? And the guy reveals he has like adamantium lace skin. It's like this thin layer of adamantium that covers him like chainmail, I believe. So he can't be so easily killed. Meanwhile, we are getting, I should say, more little pages about other realms and other worlds. I went through the first 2, but I guess I'm just going to skip past that now. And Logan comes up to Solem, and they find this forge where they were able, like, I should say, Muramasa was able to reforge his blades into these twin blades, like, that are hotter than anything because that were forged in fires hotter than anything because they were forged in hell. He's been creating these blades for the beasts directly in hell, which is kind of interesting. It's just part of this new level of the hand that's like completely demonic and been corrupted and has been building up their powers in hell. uh, and then they consummate these blades by impaling them on Muramasa himself. At which point, Logan and Solem arrive and kill the demons wielding these blades, and Solem takes one for himself. But this demon, I guess the beast, grabs Wolverine, and Solem's like, I should just let you die here. These swords can cut through adamantium, so they're like the one thing that can kill me, and you're supposed to fight me in this tournament. But I'm feeling generous, and you kind of helped me get this blade. Like, what do you say we make a deal? And I'll give you one of these swords and let you, kill the demon and let you go free. And Logan basically agrees to this deal under uncertain terms. And Logan says, well, I have my sword, but it came with a price. Only time will tell if it is worth the cost. And he comes up to the Otherworld portal and stands in his place. And now we have Magic and Logan ready to go. So with that, we are, 4 parts into X of Swords, 2 swords up, ready to go. Next up, and our final book that we're talking about today, and the most recent part in X of Swords, is Marauders number 13. And it deals with our third character. Oh, Adrian says, I hope they don't end Wolverine again. Well, so far this series has been rock solid. I recommend all the books, and would do the same. We open Marauders up with a quote from an Onslaught survivor. That's interesting. But this book's all about Storm getting her sword. And it's kind of interesting because Marauders up until now, I believe, has been written by Duggan. We have a guest writer, I guess, Vida Ayala, and they write Black Hammer and a bunch of other indie books, but I believe this is their first superhero book. I could be wrong, but this book was amazing. Matteo Lolli does the artwork, Edgar Delgado does the coloring. It feels very different than what Marauders has been up until now, but that feels appropriate because it's so focused on Storm. And it's all about her basically getting this vibranium sword from Wakanda. It shouldn't be too surprising, but it's just so excellent. It really takes its time to tell its story. And Ayala just does such a good job at acting like they've been doing this for decades. Like they're the one who has been writing for Storm and Marauders and Black Panther all of this time. I don't know how they did it, but they do such a good job at just crafting this in-universe story for Storm and how she gets her sword. Out of all these books, I think I liked Marauders the most. So we open on Kitty Pryde, newly resurrected and come back, chatting with Storm, and she knows that she has to go and get the sword. Pride, I guess I should say Kate, offers to go with her, but Storm says she has to do this alone. It's on this 2-page spread, and it's surrounded by these panels showing all these little greatest hits of Storm's life, going back to her earliest days where she survived that bombing and developed claustrophobia, to her time on the streets of, I believe, Cairo, to her discovering her powers and joining up with the X-Men, her history with the original Marauders, and becoming a teacher and part of Krakoa. It's a journey. It's cool. And then we learn the story of the sword she's getting. It's called Skybreaker and was actually the first sword forged of vibranium in Wakandan history. So, as you can imagine, it might be important to them. It also has special properties unique to other elements of vibranium that scientists and Wakandan mystics have studied for years and were unable to determine the origin of. It's very cool. We learn a lot about this sword throughout this book. And again, that goes into just, I don't know how much Ayala consulted with Hickman and everyone else in making this book, but they nailed I don't know, just how cool and how in line it is with everything else we know. There's a lot of history to the other swords that we already kind of knew about before, but this one's great. The Storm goes to Wakanda, and she knows this is going to be difficult, and apparently T'Challa is busy and unavailable at the moment, so she talks to Queen Ramonda and Princess Shuri. And they have a very warm greeting, and she explains what's going on. Wakanda very much says they're here to help, but Storm says, well, the thing is, we don't need like an army or even warriors. We have the warriors. We need specific swords. And they're like, okay, great. Wakanda has all these swords that like are mystical and powerful in nature. The Nation Maker, the Panther's Claws, the King's Mercy. I think the King's Mercy has been a thing before. But she says, no, I need Skybreaker. And they're like, well, okay, you know why that's going to be an issue. Like, Storm is a former queen of Wakanda. She knows their history and stuff. And as we later learn in this book, T'Challa specifically showed her where that sword is, as Storm later suspects, or later says she suspects, but believes, like has believed for a long time. She was shown that and shown the security around that sword specifically because she thinks T'Challa thought one day she might need to take it. Later that night, Shuri greets Storm, and in a brilliantly written conversation between the two, and it's also well drawn because it's all in like the expression and in the words. It's very clear Shuri knows Storm is going to try and take the sword and tries to be like, hey, maybe don't do this. It could cause civil war within Wakanda if we try and defend your actions, and if not, provoke outright war between Wakanda and Krakoa, basically the two most powerful nations on Earth. Maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe you should wait until my brother shows up and like we can sort these things out. And Storm is cordial, but like doesn't acknowledge she's going to do this. Shuri doesn't outright call her out on it. It's all just kind of under the surface of the words they're saying, and like her saying like, well, like we want to help you. We can make this right. Wait until T'Challa comes back. Like all these things that they're saying. And Storm's like, well, like she gets what Shuri's saying. She understands what she's saying, but she pretty much switches out of her diplomatic clothing into her X-Men uniform and goes to infiltrate the prison, outright attacking the guards and stuff like that. Like she's not playing around. This is an emergency. Earth is in danger. This book makes it very clear, like Arakko will come and will just pillage the whole world if they don't do something about this. Then she goes to get it. Obviously, Shuri is pretty much there waiting for her to do so, because like I said, it was all clearly laid out in that scene without it being explicitly said, not in narration, not in anything. It's all just, like, I really appreciate the relatively subtle writing, considering we're dealing with what becomes a fight between Shuri wielding, like, laser blast shooting gauntlets and a lady who can control the weather with her mind. So it's cool that you have this relatively clever and well-written character writing going on around, like, just a fun story about a lady getting a sword with superpowers. So she eventually is able to topple Shuri and seizes the Skybreaker for herself. Storm begins to make her way out. There is obviously defenses to stop her, but no real match for Storm, who's able to unleash like lightning powers and the likes. But pretty soon she comes across Black Panther with an entourage of guards waiting for her at the gate to Krakoa. And he says, like, why are you doing this? Why would you betray me? I probably would have helped you and given the sword, in spite of the fact that my people would have had so much trouble accepting it. And she's like, because you made me wait, and my life does not revolve around your whims or whatever game you were playing with that. I have this sword, and like, T'Challa was briefed on all of this by his mom, so it's an interesting moment between the two, and it doesn't really end on full animosities. Like, whatever, go, let her go. We could have done this together, but Storm says this is bigger than you and me, bigger than Wakanda, Krakoa, and she like was not willing to wait for him to decide that he had the time. And to be fair, T'Challa is in charge of like what the equivalent of S.H.I.E.L.D. now, and the Avengers, and his own country. Like, he's got a lot on his plate, but and I think it's a well-written moment, because you can understand where Wakanda's kind of coming from in this. And you can also understand Storm's sense of urgency and not wanting to, like, dick around with this diplomacy, because one way or another she needed this sword, and she was going to get it. I can kind of appreciate it. This is definitely a better moment than, say, like Avengers versus X-Men when they got abruptly divorced. This is an interesting detente between the two. So Storm goes to the portal, and Black Panther orders the gate to be destroyed. And she's like, if the emissary of Krakoa, Storm, wants to return, it will not be done in the, like, as a thief in the night, but like with Wakanda under our terms. So things are not outright hostile between Wakanda and Krakoa, but have gotten a lot more frosty. And as Storm says on her return, like it'll be work to get back trust for this sword, but we did what we had to do. And it's an interesting moment because that is pretty much what happened with Logan getting the sword. There was a cost to getting that blade, and we will have to see what that cost is one day. And then she joins in the circle, and it's kind of fun because whereas it was like a very dramatic moment when Logan and Magic arrived, it is like when Storm puts Skybreaker into the ground at Logan and Magic's side, but it's just kind of funny because at this point, Logan and Magic, clearly bored, are sitting down beside their blades, and Logan says, "Never doubted you for a second, darling." And the last line of this book is Magic saying, "Welcome to the party." And that is it for the most recent chapters of X of Swords. Try 3 says, Wakanda doesn't care about invasions. LOL, they usually try and hold out. Or they usually always hold out. It's everywhere else that falls. You know, and they shouldn't feel that way. They should have been humbled by Empire because they did fall in Empire and would have been lost were it not for the larger invasion being pulled back. But like Black Panther fell in part of that alien invasion, and I mean the Kotati went for Wakanda specifically and hard, but they like Wakanda lost that fight, and it was only the actions of like others and the Avengers and stuff that saved Wakanda. So they should heed the warnings of the X-Men and probably should have just like been like, your traditions or whatever, they'll take care of the sword or they won't, and either way we got to do what we got to do to save it, which is pretty much what Wakanda did. But like I said, I understand their perspective and why they were like, there should be a reason for people to doubt the royal family at this point, and for there to be dissent in Wakanda, and for this to be potential ammunition for that dissent. I don't really know exactly what's going on in the world of the Black Panther series. If what's their face? Ayala is part of that line, and if they're kind of going in that direction. But that was a great issue. All 4 of these I really liked. They each kind of are telling their own story. Like Wolverine and X Factor is insanely linked, way more than they were before, but they're all just so great. And it leaves me pretty excited for X of Swords. Like I said at the beginning of this review, I don't really know where I stand in terms of reading every single one of these books. I don't necessarily have them all on reservation, even looking at the most upcoming ones. But I kind of am feeling more and more motivated to get them and maybe to get a little more involved with the X-Men series so we can go through this entire run, because so far I've been having fun. D. Murphy1578 was saying, woo, Solemn is so cool so far, read them all now. Yeah, I like him too. He seems like a new character. Oh, and let's talk a little bit about what his cost is. I don't know what it is. It could be something like Logan's Soul or something like that. My impression after reading this book, and I'm guessing here, but if I were guessing, like the thing I got out of it, and the way Solemn's character is written, and he's kind of like this well-admired outcast of sorts in Araco, I think the deal he reached with Wolverine is if Krakoa wins the tournament, I want to be allowed to live on Krakoa, like, without any reservations, as one of your citizens. And Logan might have said, okay, you got a deal. I could be wrong, but that was the impression I got out of, like, the character and what he might, like, how he might kind of play this tournament as a little bit of insurance for himself. I don't know. D. Murphy was saying, I think he wants out too. Okay, well, I'm not the only one thinking that. He's a cool character. I hope he sticks around. Actually, I really like all of the Arakoan characters we've seen so far. I didn't expect us to kind of cut to them during the tournament preparation the way we have been so far. But like the horsemen and the fact that there's going to be 10 of them is kind of cool. Like they're going to be real characters. And that's where reading all of these X of Swords books might kind of be important and pay off a big deal. So far, the tie-ins very much are, aside from X Factor, each character kind of going off and getting their own sword. So if you're just kind of focusing on like just the X-Men and just the X of Swords core books, it might not be that bad. You won't know the full story behind these swords and which characters were chosen and why, but I don't necessarily think it's critical to enjoying the larger movement on the X-Men if you don't want to buy or can't afford 22 books, which is understandable. And I've gotten a lot of questions about that kind of like around these and in comments and stuff along the way, so that's why I've been talking about it throughout this 45-minute review. Bucket Think Tank was saying, Civil War on Wakanda sounds like a fun idea story-wise, and seeing how the superhero and supervillain community reacts to it. I think so. Also, if you've been reading like Avengers books and kind of that line of comics, Wakanda has a lot of important power, influence, and an important role in the overall world, since they've kind of taken on the role of S.H.I.E.L.D. in like global superhero politics at this point. So that was the impression I got out of this Marauders book, and that's why I was like, I don't know if Ayala's like kind of potentially taking over Black Panther going forward. I don't really know what that situation is. Like I said, I'm not caught up or really familiar with what's going on with Black Panther specifically at this moment, aside from the Avengers stuff. But if that's the direction and this is our taste of what Ayala can do, holy crap. Because the key thing about Marauders number 13 is it is firmly an X-Men and Black Panther book at the same time. And Ayala's ability to write a story with both like a sense of authority behind characters like Shuri and T'Challa, while also doing the same with Kate Pryde and Storm, and it feeling very in tune with the sort of tone we've been expecting out of these X-Men characters, and also what I would expect out of Black Panther from what I know of those characters at the moment. Like, I don't know, like I said, I'm not fully caught up in that world, but I am on Avengers. Like, if Black Panther's just all Avengers at the moment, then I'm fully caught up. I don't know if there's some other series I'm not actively reading at the moment, though, with Black Panther or something. I would imagine there is, though, so there you go. Kind of interesting, too, because Marauders also gives us a taste of like what the world of Wakanda looks like without Black Panther immediately around, and you have characters like Shuri and others kind of taking the reins. And in a world where like all four of these books have that tribute in it and the little banner celebrating Chadwick Boseman in it, that gives us a sense of what kind of story we might expect out of Wakanda without Black Panther. Which is sad and unfortunate, but the reality, not necessarily of the comics, but of the MCU, at least for now. And I think that's the direction Marvel probably is planning. Not necessarily that's what they were doing with Marauders, but by circumstance, that really is what we get out of the book, because T'Challa's not around for a huge chunk of it. D. Murphy was saying, I like the switch. I thought Wolverine was going to reforge the Red Blade and the Black Blade would come into play. Or Silver Samurai. It's interesting characters that have and haven't been included in all of this. It's also interesting some plot threads that don't seem as relevant as I thought they were going to be. Those include Kate Pryde's resurrection, Russia, and Colossus, who doesn't seem like a huge part of the story so far. Ileana doesn't seem bothered or anything much by the fact that Colossus is currently imprisoned. Maybe she doesn't know, but it'll be interesting to see if that boot drops, or if it doesn't, and Ileana just doesn't feel that attached to Russia, given that, she has no positive memories of it, I don't think, or association with it. And maybe she's certainly a chaotic good or neutral character, to put it in D&D terms, enough that maybe she's okay with Colossus being imprisoned and interrogated, so long as they don't, like, permanently harm or traumatize him. I don't know. I don't know how she feels about that. My guess is less so. She would probably be like, well, it would like free my brother immediately. But a lot of X-Men knew about Beast being, or like Colossus being publicly imprisoned, so maybe she does know. And doesn't care. That's fascinating if true. I really don't know where they're going with that. D. Murphy says Colossus feels like a drop thread. I don't. Well, for now, that's true, but I don't think long term that's true. Unless like Duggan's just done with X-Men abruptly. But I have a feeling it'll kick back in after X of Swords or something if Rush is not going to be a part of X of Swords. I thought it was. I really thought that was going to be the thrust of X of Swords far more than anything with this Araco stuff. But we'll see. D. Murphy says, I want a huge payoff on it. I do too. I don't want that story to be dropped. But the thing about that Russia thing is all those characters, aside from like Wolverine, aren't super involved with X of Swords so far. Beast hasn't been a huge character in all of this. Bosses hasn't been a huge character so far. Like none of those Russian villains are involved so far. Kate was kind of involved in that. Wait, no, who am I? There's other characters. Oh, Omega Red too. Was kind of just imprisoned, and that hasn't been a huge thing yet. So we'll see. So far, the X-Men mine have not been like forgetting plot lines, even if stuff gets dropped for a while. There's still like a whole island out there that Emma Frost had Magneto seize, and we don't know the whole story behind what the plan is for that. Like, there's a lot of stuff up in the air, and I think the impression I'm getting now that we're seeing more and more of X of Swords is that X of Swords really is just about this tournament and maybe some stuff with Otherworld and all of that, and everything else is just like, no, X-Men have a big future ahead of it, and it's not all being covered here. Although early X of Swords books did very much reference that there are other enemies out there, and there's bigger things beyond just what's going on with Otherworld at the moment. So I don't know if it's dropped entirely for this storyline or if it's going to come into play as part of a twist or something like that. We don't know if this whole thing is going to be this tournament. Although at the rate that they're kind of bringing in these champions, it very much seems like it is. So that just means, like D. Murphy, you're saying that you want a huge payoff on it. That kind of strengthens that idea because it means, oh no, there's whole story arcs planned for that stuff, I think, because we haven't heard anything from it in a while. D. Murphy says, I want Magic to go kill the hell out of Beast or send him into limbo. Well, it's interesting because that thought ran through Colossus too, about like just grabbing Beast and pounding him into the ground. It was an interesting moment of writing for sure. Try3 was saying Beast and Colossus were central in X-Force with Domino. Well, and it's interesting because we've kind of derailed that completely to get into this X of Swords stuff for now. I can see why people might be upset about that. It's a little frustrating if you're just reading X of Swords because this issue must come out of nowhere and make very little sense. Like, where does it pick up on? Yeah, it picks up on Logan just going into hell and a quote from Silver Samurai. There is some explanations as we go along, but it is very much, it feels like a tie-in. So if you were reading a random series and it's like, oh, we're randomly dealing with some other story right now, which isn't great. But X of Swords, the world of Krakoa and X-Men post House of X has always been very crossover heavy and kind of expecting you to know random stuff from other X-Men series. So it demands a lot out of the reader. Personally, because I know all these things, because I've read these books, because I like these books, it's been a fun ride, and I do recommend them personally. But you gotta know a lot, and that makes it real hard for people to enter into this thing without a ton of back knowledge. Even with every single one of these 4 books, taking the time to kind of explain things as they go along, it's like, well, at this point you kind of have to know Krakoa because we're not explaining that, we're explaining Araco to people. At a certain point, it's just so much. I like it, and there is a great jumping on point in the form of that House of X book, but you gotta read that House of X book before you touch any of this stuff. Otherwise, nothing's gonna make sense. Adrian's saying, I wonder if this Otherworld stuff is going to force the Avengers to say your area is dangerous, like Krakoa is dangerous, we need to have access. That's an interesting idea. I wonder, I do often think to myself, if there weren't a way to kind of share some of the Krakoan fun with the rest of the superhero community, specifically the Resurrection Protocol, so we can kind of put a little needle into all that nonsense about you know, comic book death once and for all. I think Hickman's take on comic book death is an almost permanent, potentially permanent way to sort of address that nonsense once and for all in a fun way. There it's like, oh, no, you can still have death mean something and be traumatic and potentially like screw up a character's identity permanently. So it having a permanent change without a character being, or without a writer getting away with just, I killed off this character, so it's a big deal, and then some other writer having to go out of their way to sort of fix it just so that they can use the character again. It's silly. This is less silly. with Even with all the craziness with the eggs, I would argue this is far less silly than the Hand resurrecting Dr. Octopus, or Spider-Man being cloned a bajillion times, or a character, well, hundreds of characters like escaping an explosion before they get away, or surviving being buried and like dug up and somehow resurrected in some crazy pit. You know, all the different resurrections. Like, those are way sillier because they have to bring them out of nowhere. Now it's all baked in. So, we'll see. It's interesting. I think eventually, like, I don't know. We haven't really gotten a huge sense of what exactly the rest of the superhero community thinks of Krakoa. We know the Fantastic Four is a little iffy on it. We know Wakanda's largely supportive. What do the Avengers think? What happens when that shoe eventually drops? You know Carol wants to go to war with the X-Men. Of course she does. That's at least the way she's always been written. Like that. I wonder what happens when eventually the human race draws a line that the X-Men aren't willing to leave uncrossed. Try3 says Black Panther did not let Storm go begrudgingly, so the Avengers know. Well, and that's part of it too, is Black Panther is in charge of the Avengers pretty much. So I wonder if we haven't seen the full shoe drop in all of this Wakanda stuff just yet. It doesn't seem that way. It seems like there very much could be consequences if Marvel so chooses to do so. But if they kind of choose to go in another way, it's open enough that, like, well, it doesn't have to be consequences to these either. There's already going to be consequences to all of this one way or another, like through Logan's sword. And I'm sure we haven't seen the end of that. Like, there's going to be more shoes to drop from all of this. There's going to be more bargains and prices to pay for all of these swords. That I am certain of. Bucket Think Tank says, what do you think will actually be the downfall of Krakoa, and how will Doom find a way to say he called it all along? Well, that's a funny part of your second comment there. People have talked about how Krakoa is doomed. I'm not so convinced necessarily. Or at least not in the... Like, the X Mansion was the X-Men's headquarters for years and years and years. It's kind of like a core part of their identity. It's not necessarily doomed. Avengers Mountain isn't necessarily doomed. It might just be the new permanent home of the Avengers until someone thinks of something else. I could see Krakoa potentially going off into space one day or something like that before it's necessarily destroyed or a downfall. Maybe the X-Men move on one day or change like their settlement, and perhaps Krakoa starts to become something like Adelan. Maybe they end up in space for a while. But I don't necessarily think downfall is the narrative arc Hickman's going for, and I truly hope it isn't. And if so, then the ultimate downfall of Krakoa might just be some random, horrible nonsense some other hacky writer does when they take over and think, oh, this stuff is too creative and too ambitious for their tastes, or they want to bring it back to the mansion, which is honestly boring in comparison. I have no interest in going back. I don't think you can. Like, certainly there's plenty of examples of back to basics type storytelling in comics before. I don't necessarily think it's a good idea. And Try3 says Carol and Rogue buried the hatchet a while back. Well, it all depends. Like, if we go by how Carol is written in her solo series and like her core identity, she shouldn't be like amped up for war. I was mostly just making a joke with how she is often written in the Avengers and crossover books, which is not good. Try3 says, I think Krakoa is here to stay. I look how much they've invested into it, and it's selling really well. Both things are true. You know what we really need, and this might happen one day, is you got to secure it in the minds of the general public, and I think that's doable. If it were me, because long term, eventually the X-Men are going to come to exist in the world of the X-Men, and to me, the next step, like what will happen is we'll get the X-Men in the MCU, we'll get Westchester, we'll get the Mansion. And if it were up to me, I would do a full phase of X-Men movies, kind of properly done, we'll say, maybe in the style of the MCU, but perhaps like with some development. Make it a little different from the X-Men movies we've seen before, and even what people might expect out of typical MCU movies. But sooner or later, maybe even go full Decimation or something, but like get people to learn about Genosha, Utopia. I would say that's the next big direction for like the X-Men's headquarters, and them like trying to survive out in the woods outside of Westchester and the comfort of all of that for a while. Do a bunch of story arcs there, and then do Krakoa. But like once, or like if we get a TV show or movie that like starts to get into some of this Krakoan content, or that What If series coming out from Marvel, get that like starts to firm up in people, or video game stuff, all of which I feel very much is on the table. The more that happens, the more likely Krakoa becomes like a semi-permanent fixture, the way Westchester is, and Genosha is, and Utopia kind of is. Yeah, like the X-Men aren't there now, but they can always go back, like they have with Westchester in the age of Krakoa, and there's lots of potential there. So I think Try3 makes the most important point, though, that it's selling really well, and that's true. And X of Swords is just pumping that along. I'm sure, like, I've been buying more X-Men books than ever before, but I want to. That's the most important thing. I want to keep reading X Factor. I want to keep reading Wolverine and X-Force and all these other series we've been talking about. Marauders. Like, yes, in some ways I buy these books to review them for you guys, but so many of these books are ones that I very much would be reading regardless of Comic Island or anything like that, which is so good for this particular line of Marvel Comics. Like from their perspective, that's a good sign. Yeah, like there's a built-in motivation to keep reading because I don't know where this is going, and I don't know where X of Swords is going. I don't know where the larger narrative of the X-Men is going, and it's so different from anything I've read from X-Men before or just superhero stuff in general that it gets me excited and eager to keep going and keep checking out new series in the X-Men line and what they have planned next. Kay Garrick was saying, I'm late, but here to show the love anyways. Well, I've noticed we've crossed the hour-long mark, which isn't crazy, but given that it's like we're only, well, yeah, it's not really anything at all. It just feels funny because it's 4 books and whatever. But thanks for joining us just the same. Kenneth Robinson, thanks for joining us too. This story has been, he says, this story's been very intriguing and I'm happy to have picked up all the Alex Ross variants so far. Very cool, dude. Glad to make another review and discussion from Comic Island. Yeah, I was glad to see you join us, and that's cool. I've been going with the traditional variants in part because these little blue things help me a little bit, but Alex Ross variants, that's great, man. That's a cool one to collect. I was going through all the variants for Batman number 100, and variant covers can be cool as long as they aren't terribly bad for books. When I mentioned how I wasn't sure about that, like how that's been going lately, some people in the comments mentioned it in a pretty neutral way, where it's pretty, if people want to buy that sort of thing, they can get it, so it's not unreasonable. But I know, and I just said that because I know both Marvel and DC have dicked around comic book stores with that sort of behavior before. I don't endorse that because comic book stores are in a precarious enough position, but if variant covers help comic book stores, then that's great. Because, some people are perfectly willing to pay far more than what a regular book costs for a variant cover. And there's some cool ass variant covers that have been kind of casually flipping by as we've been chatting. Uh, so I don't fault people at all for wanting to get in on that. Like, look at this one. This one had me laugh so much. It's like a mix of old X-Force teams with like Banana Dude. It's so great. um, Adrian, or sorry, Try Three. I'll get to your comment, Adrian, but Try Three makes a really good point. I really like how they made Apocalypse three-dimensional and not just a mustache twirler. Agreed. This is kind of the best Apocalypse has been written in a long time outside of like Kid A and all of that stuff. He's tough and clearly the villain that he once was, but also is so much on board with the Krakoan movement, which is in character for him, while also like dealing with his children, and we're seeing that side of him and like his roots in ancient Egypt, stuff we didn't necessarily know about, but in my opinion, in hindsight, makes a lot of sense based on what we know of his character and stuff, and him being like the original mutant and all that business. That idea. I don't even know if that's true or whatever, but like that concept of him being like this ancient, early founder of the mutant race, and now being this core part of this story and this potential reunion between Arakko and Krakoa. I kind of think that's the direction we're going, to be honest. And Krakoa is going to end up bigger than ever out of this thing, and changed, and changed in ways we don't necessarily know, with new characters coming along by the looks of it. Kenneth Robinson saying, "Ooh, I needed that Storm variant." I guess in the one that I was talking about earlier. There's so many cool ones, and if you can afford that sort of thing, I'd totally endorse it. There's a lot of cool variants out there for some of these X-Men books, and create like ones that are creative and cartoony, like that banana one, or ones that are just awesome images of Storm or Wolverine and stuff like that. Adrian is saying, I think one thing that would be amusing when Storm took the sword, if she would say, I am goddamn Storm like an all-star Frank Miller Batman. No way, dude. I just personally, I disagree. Mostly because that last line she has is so good and so... But, like, I love the way Ayala... like I said, the first taste of this writer doing anything for a superhero book, and it felt like this person has been doing it for decades. Storm says, I have been a protector longer than I have been a wife. I know the sacrifices that must be made. I know who I am. And she sticks the sword in the ground. Like, god damn. That's the perfect end line to this book, all about this character and her finding herself. Bucket Think Tank says, you should say Thundercats Hell. Well, okay, maybe that's a close second option. But yeah, alright, I think we're going to call it there. That was a nice long stream, and I got things to do and so many more books to talk about because I've kind of fallen behind. In part because I've noticed the way things have been going, I think it's better I try and find a little bit more of a balance between like our regular sort of content and these streams. So we're going to space them out a little bit so that I can also kind of do work on other stuff. And I knew this stream was going to be long. But nevertheless, next up, we're going to talk a little bit more about Immortal Hulk, and featuring a different writer from Al Ewing, which is kind of cool. So stay tuned for that and a whole bunch of other stuff. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time here on Comic Island. Oh, and special thanks to everyone who chatted along the way and all that.